Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I'm a forensic pathologist at Riverside County Coroner's office in California. Or at least I was until I submitted my resignation 3 weeks ago. You can call me Dr. Sarah Chen if you want, though most people in the morgue just called me Doc during my 15 years there. I've performed over 3,000 autopsies in my career. Homicides, suicides, overdoses, accidents, and every kind of death the human body can experience. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about human anatomy and ultimately led me to leave forensic pathology entirely. Riverside County Coroner's Office handles approximately 4,500 cases per year, serving over 2.4 million residents across one of the largest counties in California. It's a state-of-the-art facility built in 2008 with 6 examination rooms, advanced imaging equipment, and a toxicology laboratory that processes some of the most complex cases on the West Coast. During my time there, I specialized in cases involving unexplained deaths, particularly those where the cause of death wasn't immediately apparent from external examination. The case I'm about to describe began on a Tuesday morning in late October 2023. It was one of those crisp autumn days where the Santa Ana winds had cleared the smog from the valleys, and you could actually see the mountains surrounding Riverside. I had arrived at the office around 6:30 a.m., earlier than usual, because I wanted to catch up on some pending toxicology reports before my first autopsy of the day. My supervisor, Chief Deputy Coroner Michael Rodriguez, had left a note on my desk asking me to prioritize a case that had come in overnight. The deceased was a 34-year-old construction worker named David Martinez, who had been found dead in his apartment by his roommate. According to the initial police report, David had complained of severe abdominal pain the previous evening, but had refused medical attention, saying he just needed to sleep it off. When his roommate checked on him the next morning, David was unresponsive in his bed. What made this case particularly interesting from a forensic standpoint was the complete absence of any obvious cause of death. David was a healthy young man with no significant medical history, no prescription medications, and no evidence of drug or alcohol use. The responding paramedics found no signs of trauma, no indications of suicide, and no environmental factors that might have contributed to his death. His roommate reported that David had been acting normally the previous day, had eaten dinner, and had even made plans for the weekend. I reviewed David's file while preparing for the autopsy. The external examination performed during intake had noted some unusual discoloration around his abdomen, a slight bluish tinting that wasn't consistent with normal post-mortem changes. His body temperature when found suggested he had died sometime between midnight and 3 a.m., roughly 6 hours before discovery. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle, and no evidence that anyone else had been in the apartment during the time of death. At 8:15 a.m., I began what I expected to be a routine autopsy to determine cause of death. David's body was wheeled into examination room 3, where I was assisted by morgue technician Lisa Valdez, who had been working with the coroner's office for over a decade. Lisa was known for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to spot anomalies that others might miss. The external examination confirmed what had been noted during intake. David appeared to be in excellent physical condition, well-nourished, with good muscle tone, and no signs of chronic illness. However, the abdominal discoloration was more pronounced under the bright examination lights. The skin had a mottled appearance, with patches of deep blue and purple that seemed to radiate outward from his navel in an almost geometric pattern. "Dr. Chen," Lisa said as she photographed the discoloration, "I've never seen post-mortem changes that look quite like this. The pattern is too uniform, too symmetrical. It almost looks deliberate." I had to agree with her assessment. In my 15 years of performing autopsies, I had seen every type of post-mortem change imaginable. Bodies decompose in predictable patterns based on environmental factors, time since death, and the deceased's physical condition. What we were seeing on David's abdomen didn't fit any of those patterns. I began the internal examination by making the standard Y-shaped incision from the shoulders to the sternum and down to the pubic bone. As I peeled back the skin and muscle tissue, I immediately noticed that David's abdominal cavity contained an unusual amount of fluid, approximately 800 milliliters of a dark, viscous liquid that had an almost oily consistency. "Lisa, I need you to collect samples of this fluid for immediate analysis," I said, using a syringe to extract several vials of the strange substance. "Have the lab run a full spectrum analysis. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with here." As I continued the examination, removing and weighing each organ according to standard protocol, everything appeared normal until I reached David's liver. The liver is typically one of the largest organs in the human body, weighing between 1,200 and 1,500 grams in a healthy adult male. But when I lifted David's liver from his abdominal cavity, it felt significantly heavier than expected. The organ itself looked normal from the outside, the typical reddish-brown color with smooth edges and no visible lesions or abnormalities. But when I placed it on the scale, it weighed 2,947 grams, nearly twice the normal weight for someone of David's size and build. "That's impossible," Lisa said, checking the scale calibration. "There's no way a liver should weigh that much unless there's massive swelling or tumor growth, and this one looks completely healthy." I agreed that the weight was medically inexplicable, but I proceeded with the examination. Using a scalpel, I made the first incision into the liver tissue to examine its internal structure. What I found defied every principle of human anatomy I had learned during medical school and my residency training. Instead of the normal liver tissue I expected to find, the interior of the organ was filled with what appeared to be a complex network of crystalline structures. These weren't kidney stones or gallstones, which I had seen countless times before. These were geometric formations that looked almost like naturally occurring crystals, but they were organic, growing directly from the liver tissue itself. The structures were translucent with a slight blue tint, and they were arranged in perfect hexagonal patterns throughout the organ. Each individual crystal was approximately 2 to 3 millimeters in length, and they were connected to each other by thin filaments that looked almost like neural pathways or blood vessels, but were unlike anything I had ever seen in human anatomy. "Lisa," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "are you seeing what I'm seeing?" She leaned in closer to examine the liver tissue, and I watched her expression change from curiosity to confusion to something approaching fear. "Dr. Chen, in 10 years of working in this morgue, I have never seen anything like this. What are those things?" I wish I had an answer for her, but I was just as baffled as she was. I had performed thousands of liver examinations, had seen every type of liver disease, cirrhosis, hepatitis, cancer, and genetic disorders. But I had never encountered anything that remotely resembled these crystalline structures growing inside human tissue. I carefully removed several of the crystal formations and placed them in sterile containers for immediate analysis. Under the microscope, the structures appeared to be composed of some kind of organic compound that had properties similar to both bone and cartilage, but with a molecular structure I couldn't identify. The most disturbing aspect was that the crystals appeared to be connected to David's nervous system. The filaments that linked them together showed characteristics similar to nerve tissue, and when I traced them through the liver, they extended beyond the organ itself, connecting to his spinal cord and branching throughout his abdominal cavity. As I continued the examination, I discovered that these crystalline networks weren't limited to David's liver. They were present in his kidneys, spleen, and pancreas, though in smaller concentrations. Each organ showed the same impossible weight increase and the same internal crystal formations connected by neural-like filaments. The most shocking discovery came when I examined David's brain. External examination had shown no signs of trauma or abnormality, but when I removed the brain and sectioned it for examination, I found that the same crystalline structures had begun forming in his cerebral cortex, specifically in the areas associated with pain perception and consciousness. "Dr. Chen," Lisa said, her voice shaking slightly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. In your professional opinion, are these structures human?" I stopped what I was doing and looked at her directly. Lisa had been in this business long enough to have seen everything the human body could produce. If she was asking that question, it meant she was thinking the same thing I was thinking, but didn't want to admit. "I don't know," I replied honestly. I've never seen anything like this in medical literature, in any textbook, or in any case study. These structures shouldn't exist in the human body, and I have no medical explanation for how they could have formed or what purpose they might serve. But there was something else that was bothering me beyond the inexplicable anatomy. The pattern of crystal formation suggested that these structures had been growing inside David's body for weeks, possibly months, before his death. The neural connections were too complex and well-developed to have formed recently. This meant that David had been walking around, working, living his normal life, while these impossible structures were slowly replacing his normal organ tissue. How had he functioned normally with organs that were fundamentally altered from standard human anatomy? How had he not experienced severe pain or organ failure as these crystals grew throughout his body? And most importantly, what had caused his death if his organs, despite their bizarre internal structure, still appeared to be functioning? I decided to examine David's stomach contents to see if there were any clues about what he had consumed in the hours before his death. What I found only deepened the mystery further. David's stomach contents were unlike anything I had encountered in 15 years of forensic pathology. Instead of the partially digested food I expected to find, his stomach contained approximately 200 milliliters of the same dark, viscous fluid I had discovered in his abdominal cavity, along with what appeared to be fragments of the same crystalline structures that had infiltrated his organs. But these fragments weren't just random pieces that had broken off from the larger formations. Under magnification, they showed signs of deliberate organization, arranged in small clusters that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm even hours after death. The stomach lining itself had adapted to accommodate these foreign structures, developing what looked like specialized pouches or chambers designed to house them. "Lisa," I said, collecting samples of the stomach contents, "I want you to call Dr. Patricia Wong in our toxicology department. Tell her this is priority 1, and that I need a full molecular analysis of everything we've collected. Don't mention the specifics over the phone, just tell her it's urgent." As I continued the examination, I made another discovery that challenged everything I thought I understood about human physiology. David's blood, when examined under the microscope, contained cells that weren't entirely human. Mixed in with normal red and white blood cells were structures that resembled blood cells in size and general appearance, but had an internal composition that included the same crystalline material I had found in his organs. These hybrid cells appeared to be fully functional, carrying oxygen and nutrients throughout the body just like normal blood cells. But they also seemed to be part of the neural network that connected the crystal formations. It was as if David's entire circulatory system had been gradually transformed into a hybrid, biological crystalline network that maintained normal bodily functions while serving some other purpose I couldn't begin to understand. The implications were staggering. If these changes had been occurring gradually over months, as the evidence suggested, then David Martinez had been living as something that was no longer entirely human. Yet according to his roommate and everyone who knew him, he had been behaving completely normally right up until the night he died. I was so absorbed in documenting these impossible findings that I didn't notice Lisa had returned from her phone call until she spoke from directly behind me. "Dr. Chen," she said, her voice tight with concern, "Dr. Wong wants to speak with you immediately. She says the preliminary analysis of the fluid samples is showing results that don't match anything in her database." I walked to the phone in the corner of the examination room, my hands still covered in surgical gloves, and dialed Dr. Wong's extension. Patricia Wong had been the chief toxicologist at Riverside County for over 20 years and had analyzed everything from exotic poisons to unknown industrial chemicals. If something was outside her experience, it was truly unprecedented. "Sarah," Patricia said as soon as she answered, "I need you to tell me exactly where these samples came from, because what I'm looking at here is impossible from a biochemical standpoint. They came from the deceased we're examining, David Martinez." "What are you finding?" "The fluid you sent me contains organic compounds that don't exist in nature, at least not on Earth. The molecular structure includes elements that are arranged in patterns I've never seen before. It's as if someone took normal human biological material and combined it with something completely foreign to create a hybrid substance that shouldn't be able to exist in a living organism." I felt a chill run down my spine as Patricia continued her explanation. The crystalline fragments you included are even more bizarre. They're showing properties of both organic tissue and inorganic crystal formations, but they're also displaying what appears to be electrical activity. Sarah, these things are generating their own electromagnetic fields, even after being removed from the body. How is that possible? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. I don't know. But I've run the test 3 times with the same results. Whatever these structures are, they're not entirely biological, but they're also not entirely artificial. It's like they represent some kind of evolutionary bridge between organic life and something else entirely. I thanked Patricia and returned to the examination table, where Lisa was waiting with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. She had been photographing and documenting everything we had found, but I could see that the implications of what we were discovering were beginning to affect her just as they were affecting me. Dr. Chen, she said quietly, I have to ask something that might sound crazy. Is it possible that David Martinez wasn't entirely human when he died? It was the question I had been avoiding, but Lisa's directness forced me to confront what we were both thinking. Based on everything we had discovered during the autopsy, David's body had been fundamentally altered by these crystalline structures in ways that defied medical explanation. His organs, his blood, even his brain had been infiltrated by formations that appeared to serve some kind of organized purpose. I don't know what David was when he died, I admitted, but based on what we found, I can say with certainty that his anatomy was not entirely human. The question is whether these changes occurred naturally, were induced by some external factor, or represent something else entirely. As I prepared to examine David's heart, the final major organ in my autopsy protocol, I noticed something that made me pause. The crystalline structures throughout his body were all connected by the neural-like filaments I had observed earlier, but the concentration surrounding his heart. When I carefully removed David's heart and placed it on the examination of these connections, was highest around his chest cavity, specifically in the area table. I immediately noticed that it was significantly larger than normal, weighing 587 grams compared to the typical 250 to 350 grams for a healthy adult male. But unlike his other organs, the heart's exterior appeared completely normal, showing no signs of the crystalline infiltration I'd found elsewhere. It wasn't until I made the first incision into the heart muscle that I discovered the most disturbing finding of the entire autopsy. The interior chambers of David's heart had been completely transformed. Instead of the normal heart valves and muscle tissue, the inside of his heart contained what appeared to be a single, large, crystalline structure that filled the entire organ. This structure was unlike the smaller crystals I had found in his other organs. It was perfectly spherical, approximately 4 centimeters in diameter, and it pulsed with a soft blue light that continued even after being removed from the body. The surface was covered in intricate patterns that looked almost like circuitry, and it was connected to every major blood vessel in David's body through the neural filament network. Lisa, I said, my voice barely audible, I need you to turn off the lights in the examination room. When she dimmed the lights, the true nature of the structure became apparent. It was generating its own light source, pulsing in a regular rhythm that matched what would have been David's normal heart rate. The patterns on its surface weren't just decorative, they were actively moving, flowing like liquid light through channels carved into the crystal's surface. Dr. Chen, Lisa whispered, that thing is still functioning. How is it still functioning when the body has been dead for over 12 hours? I had no answer for her question, but I knew we were looking at something that challenged every assumption about life, death, and human biology. This crystalline structure had somehow replaced David's heart while maintaining all of its essential functions, but it was clearly not of human origin. As I documented this final discovery, I began to piece together a theory about what might have happened to David Martinez. The evidence suggested that over a period of months, his body had been gradually infiltrated and transformed by these crystalline structures. They had integrated with his organs, his blood, and his nervous system while somehow maintaining his normal human appearance and behavior. But what had caused his death? If these structures were capable of maintaining normal bodily functions, even improving them in some cases, what had gone wrong on the night he died? The answer came when I examined the neural connections more closely. The filament network that connected all of the crystalline structures throughout David's body showed signs of massive electrical overload in the hours before his death. It was as if the entire system had experienced some kind of catastrophic failure, like a computer network that had been overwhelmed by too much data. The abdominal pain David had complained about wasn't from organ failure or disease. It was from the neural network literally burning out, causing excruciating pain as the connections between the crystalline structures were severed by electrical overload. But what could have caused such a systematic failure in a network that had been functioning perfectly for months? I decided to examine David's personal effects, which had been collected from his apartment and stored with his body. Sometimes the answer to mysterious deaths lies not in the body itself, but in the circumstances surrounding the person's final days. His roommate had provided a detailed timeline of David's activities leading up to his death, and I wanted to cross-reference that information with what I was finding during the autopsy. David's wallet, keys, and cell phone had been placed in a sealed evidence bag. When I examined his phone, I noticed something unusual. The device was completely dead, which wasn't particularly remarkable, but when Lisa plugged it into a charger, it wouldn't turn on at all. The phone appeared to have suffered some kind of electrical damage, as if it had been subjected to a powerful electromagnetic pulse. "Dr. Chen," Lisa said, examining the phone more closely. "Look at this. The metal components inside the phone are actually warped, like they were heated to extreme temperatures very quickly." I took the phone and examined it under magnification. The internal circuitry showed signs of damage consistent with exposure to intense electromagnetic fields. The same type of damage I might expect to see in electronic devices that had been struck by lightning or exposed to military-grade electromagnetic warfare equipment. But David had been found in his apartment bedroom, nowhere near any source of electromagnetic interference that could cause this type of damage. Unless, I realized with growing concern, the source of the electromagnetic pulse had been David himself. I returned to examining the crystalline structure I had removed from David's heart. Under close inspection, the patterns on its surface weren't just decorative or functional, they were diagnostic. The flowing light patterns showed areas where the structure had overloaded, creating cascade failures throughout the entire network. It was becoming clear that David Martinez had died because the artificial system that had replaced his organs had experienced a catastrophic malfunction. But I still had no explanation for how these structures had gotten into his body in the first place, or what their ultimate purpose had been. I decided to call Dr. James Morrison, a colleague of mine who specialized in unusual pathological cases at the UCLA Medical Center. James had consulted on several cases over the years that involved unexplained anatomical anomalies, and I hoped he might have encountered something similar. "James," I said when he answered his phone, "I need to run something by you that's going to sound completely insane, but I need your professional opinion." I described the crystalline structures, the neural networks, and the electromagnetic properties of David's organs. James listened without interrupting, which told me he was taking my description seriously despite how impossible it sounded. "Sarah," he said after I finished, "what you're describing sounds similar to a case I consulted on about 8 months ago in Los Angeles. A 28-year-old woman found dead in her apartment with no apparent cause of death. The autopsy revealed similar crystalline structures in her organs, though not as extensive as what you're describing." My heart rate increased as James continued. "We couldn't determine the cause of death either, but the structures we found showed signs of the same type of electromagnetic overload you mentioned. The case was eventually classified as death due to unknown causes, but it bothered me for months afterward." "James," I said, "do you still have tissue samples from that case? I think we might be dealing with something systematic here, not isolated incidents. I'll check our storage facility, but Sarah, there's something else you should know." After that case, I started paying more attention to unusual deaths in the region. Over the past year, I've heard rumors from colleagues about at least 6 similar cases across Southern California. All young, healthy individuals found dead with no apparent cause, all with some kind of unexplained anatomical anomalies discovered during autopsy. The implication was staggering. If James was right, David Martinez wasn't an isolated case. There could be dozens of people walking around with these crystalline structures in their bodies, living normal lives until their biological systems experienced catastrophic failure. I thanked James and asked him to send me any information he could gather about similar cases. Then I returned to David's body to conduct one final examination that I had been putting off because I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. I needed to examine David's brain more thoroughly. The initial examination had revealed crystalline structures in his cerebral cortex, but I wanted to understand exactly which areas of the brain had been affected and whether there was any pattern to the infiltration. When I sectioned David's brain and examined it under magnification, I discovered that the crystalline structures weren't randomly distributed throughout the brain tissue. They were concentrated in specific areas: the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory formation; the prefrontal cortex, which controls decision-making and personality; and most disturbingly, the areas associated with consciousness and self-awareness. The structures in David's brain were smaller and more delicate than those I had found in his other organs, but they were connected to the same neural network that extended throughout his body. It appeared that whatever had infiltrated David's body hadn't just replaced his organs, it had also been monitoring and possibly influencing his thoughts and behavior. "Lisa," I said, realizing the full implications of what we had discovered, "I don't think David Martinez died from organ failure. I think he died because something was controlling his body, and when that control system malfunctioned, it killed him." The thought was terrifying. If these crystalline structures were capable of integrating with human organs and neural systems while maintaining normal appearance and behavior, how many other people might be walking around in similar conditions? How would we identify them? And most importantly, who or what was responsible for placing these structures in human bodies? I spent the rest of that day documenting every aspect of David's autopsy with unprecedented detail. I photographed the crystalline structures from every angle, collected tissue samples from each affected organ, and prepared detailed reports of all my findings. I had a feeling that this case was going to require extensive follow-up investigation, and I wanted to ensure that no detail was overlooked. As I was preparing to close David's body and complete the autopsy, Lisa made one final observation that sent chills down my spine. "Dr. Chen," she said, pointing to the crystalline structure I'd removed from David's heart, "look at the light patterns on that thing. They're not random." I looked more closely at the pulsing lights on the crystal's surface. Lisa was right. The patterns weren't random electrical activity from a dying system. They were organized, rhythmic, almost like a form of communication. The lights pulsed in sequences, paused, then repeated the same sequences with slight variations. "It's trying to communicate," I said, more to myself than to Lisa. Even after being removed from the body, this structure is still active, still trying to transmit some kind of information. But communicate with what and why? The implications were becoming more disturbing by the hour. David Martinez hadn't just died from a medical anomaly. He had died because some kind of artificial intelligence or control system had been operating inside his body. And when that system failed, it had killed him. I placed the crystalline heart structure in a specially shielded container designed to block electromagnetic signals. I wasn't sure what it was trying to communicate with, but I didn't want to take any chances that it might succeed in making contact with whatever had put it there in the first place. As I completed the final documentation for David's autopsy, I realized that I was faced with an impossible decision. How do you report findings that challenge every principle of human anatomy and suggest the existence of technology that shouldn't exist on Earth? How do you tell a family that their loved one died because something had been controlling his body from the inside? But more importantly, how do you warn the public that there might be others walking among us who aren't entirely human anymore, and that we have no way to identify them until they die? I decided to classify David's cause of death as undetermined pending further investigation and to submit all of my tissue samples and documentation to the CDC for analysis. If there were similar cases occurring across the country, the Centers for Disease Control would be the appropriate agency to coordinate a response. However, I also made copies of all my findings and stored them in a secure location outside of the coroner's office. I had a feeling that once I submitted my report, there would be significant pressure to downplay or suppress the more unusual aspects of David's case, and I wanted to ensure that the evidence was preserved regardless of any official response. That evening, as I was preparing to leave the office, I received a phone call that confirmed my worst fears about the implications of David's case. "Dr. Chen," the caller said, identifying himself as Agent Robert Kim from the FBI's Los Angeles field office. We understand you performed an autopsy today on David Martinez. We need to schedule a meeting with you first thing tomorrow morning to discuss your findings. I asked Agent Kim how the FBI had learned about David's case so quickly, considering that I hadn't yet submitted my final report to any federal agencies. Dr. Chen, he said, his tone becoming more serious, we've been monitoring similar cases across several states. David Martinez is part of a pattern we've been investigating for the past 18 months. We need your complete cooperation in this matter, and I need to emphasize that this investigation involves national security issues that require absolute confidentiality. The phone call ended with Agent Kim scheduling a meeting for 7 a.m. the following morning at the coroner's office. As I hung up the phone, I realized that David's case was much larger than I had initially thought. If the FBI was already investigating similar deaths across multiple states, then whatever was happening to people like David Martinez was happening on a scale that posed a potential threat to public safety. That night, I went home to my apartment in downtown Riverside and tried to process everything I had discovered during David's autopsy. I had performed over 3,000 autopsies in my career, but I had never encountered anything that challenged my understanding of human biology the way this case had. As I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing my notes and photographs from the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The crystalline structures, the neural networks, the electromagnetic properties, they all suggested a level of technology that was far beyond anything I knew to be currently available. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the advanced technology itself. It was the fact that this technology had been successfully integrated into human bodies without the knowledge or consent of the people involved. David Martinez had lived for months with artificial systems controlling his organs and possibly influencing his thoughts, and he had never known it. How many other people were walking around in similar conditions? How long had this been happening, and who was responsible for placing these systems in human bodies without their knowledge? I realized that my meeting with Agent Kim the following morning might provide some answers, but it would probably raise even more questions. Federal agencies don't get involved in routine autopsy cases, which meant that David's death was connected to something much larger than a single unexplained medical anomaly. As I prepared for bed that night, I made a decision that would ultimately lead to my resignation from the coroner's office 3 weeks later. I decided that regardless of what the FBI told me about confidentiality and national security, I had an obligation to document and preserve the truth about what I had discovered in David Martinez's body. The public had a right to know if there were people walking among us who had been altered by unknown technology. Families had a right to know if their loved ones might be at risk of sudden death from the failure of artificial systems they didn't know they had. And the medical community had a right to know about anatomical anomalies that challenged everything we thought we understood about human biology. But I also knew that my decision to prioritize truth over official secrecy would probably end my career in forensic pathology. Once you cross federal agencies on matters they consider classified, your professional reputation and employment prospects become severely limited. As I fell asleep that night, I couldn't help but think about David Martinez and what his final hours must have been like. Had he known that something was wrong with his body? Had he felt the artificial systems failing? Had he been aware that he was dying because something that wasn't human had malfunctioned inside him? The questions haunted me, and I knew they would continue to haunt me regardless of what Agent Kim told me the following morning. The next morning arrived with an unsettling stillness that seemed to permeate the entire coroner's office. I had arrived at 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes before my scheduled meeting with Agent Kim, hoping to review my findings one more time and prepare for what I suspected would be a very difficult conversation. As I walked through the empty corridors toward my office, I noticed that the building felt different somehow. The usual morning bustle of staff preparing for the day's cases was absent, and an eerie quiet had settled over the facility. When I reached my office, I found Agent Kim already waiting for me, along with 2 other individuals who introduced themselves as Dr. Elizabeth Harper from the CDC and Agent Maria Santos from what she described as a specialized federal task force. Dr. Chen, Agent Kim said, rising from his chair as I entered, thank you for meeting with us on such short notice. We've reviewed your preliminary findings regarding David Martinez, and we need to discuss the implications of your discoveries. Dr. Harper stepped forward and extended her hand. Dr. Chen, I've been following your work in forensic pathology for several years. Your reputation for thoroughness and accuracy is why we're here today. What you've discovered in the Martinez case is consistent with a pattern we've been tracking across 17 states over the past 2 years. 17 states, I repeated, feeling a chill run down my spine. How many cases are we talking about? Agent Santos consulted a tablet she was carrying. As of yesterday, we've documented 847 deaths that share the characteristics you observed in David Martinez. Young, healthy individuals with no apparent cause of death, all found to have similar crystalline structures and neural networks during autopsy. The number was staggering. Nearly 900 people had died from the same mysterious condition I had discovered in David's body. And somehow federal agencies had been tracking these deaths without any of this information reaching the medical community or the public. Dr. Chen, Dr. Harper continued, we need your complete cooperation in this investigation, but we also need your absolute discretion. What you've discovered represents a threat to national security that could cause widespread panic if it became public knowledge. I look agents sitting at the 3 federal in my office and realize that my worst fears about official suppression were about to become reality. They weren't here to seek my expertise or to coordinate a proper medical response to this phenomenon. They were here to control the flow of information and ensure that the truth about these deaths remained classified. With all due respect, I said, choosing my words carefully, I'm a forensic pathologist, not a national security official. My obligation is to determine cause of death accurately and to ensure that families receive truthful information about their loved ones. I can't participate in covering up medical findings that might save lives. Agent Kim's expression hardened slightly. Dr. Chen, you need to understand that this situation involves technology and circumstances that are beyond the scope of normal medical practice. The crystalline structures you found in David Martinez's body are not of human origin, and their presence in American citizens represents a threat that requires federal oversight, not of human origin, I repeat. Are you telling me that David Martinez was killed slowly, by alien technology? Dr. Harper glanced at Agent Kim before responding. We're telling you that the technology involved in these deaths is not currently available through any known human scientific or medical capabilities. The molecular structures, the electromagnetic properties, the integration with human biological systems. All of these represent advances that are decades beyond our current understanding. Agent Santos leaned forward in her chair. Dr. Chen, we've been investigating these cases for over 2 years, and we've made some disturbing discoveries about how these structures are being introduced into human bodies. The people who die from these failures aren't random victims. They've all been exposed to specific environmental conditions or have consumed certain substances that we believe serve as delivery mechanisms for the crystalline technology. What kind of environmental conditions? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Water supplies in certain geographic regions, Dr. Harper explained. Air quality in specific industrial areas. Even some food products that have been contaminated either accidentally or deliberately. We're still trying to determine whether this represents an invasion, an experiment, or something else entirely. The implications were becoming more terrifying by the minute. If these agents were correct, then nearly 900 Americans had been unknowingly infected with alien technology that had gradually replaced their organs and neural systems before ultimately killing them. And if the delivery mechanisms were environmental, then potentially thousands or even millions of people could be walking around with these structures in their bodies right now. Dr. Chen, Agent Kim said, interrupting my thoughts, we need you to transfer all of your findings, tissue samples, and documentation regarding David Martinez to our custody. We also need your commitment that you will not discuss this case with anyone outside of authorized personnel. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. In the distance, I could see the San Bernardino Mountains rising against the morning sky. The same mountains I had admired just yesterday when I thought the most complicated thing I would encounter was determining why a healthy young man had died unexpectedly. I can't do that, I said, turning back to face the 3 agents. I won't participate in hiding information that could help identify other people at risk. If there are environmental factors that are exposing people to this technology, then the public has a right to know, so they can protect themselves. Dr. Harper's expression became more sympathetic. Dr. Chen, I understand your ethical concerns, but you need to consider the broader implications. If word of this gets out before we understand what we're dealing with, it could cause mass hysteria. People would stop drinking water, stop eating food, stop living their normal lives based on incomplete information. And how many more people will die while you're conducting your secret investigation? I asked. How many families will lose loved ones to something that might be preventable if they knew what to watch for? Agent Santos stood up and walked to where I was standing by the window. Dr. Chen, we're not the enemies here. We're trying to protect American citizens from a threat that we don't fully understand yet, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't cause more harm than good. I looked at Agent Santos and saw genuine concern in her eyes, but I also saw the cold calculation of someone who had been trained to prioritize national security over individual rights. These agents might believe they were protecting the public, but they were also willing to let people die to maintain their control over the situation. I need some time to consider your request, I said finally. This isn't a decision I can make lightly. Agent Kim checked his watch. Dr. Chen, we need your answer by the end of the business day today. If you're not willing to cooperate voluntarily, we'll be forced to invoke national security provisions that will require your compliance. The threat was clear. Cooperate voluntarily or be compelled to cooperate through legal mechanisms that I probably couldn't fight. I had been a forensic pathologist for 15 years, but I had never been faced with a situation where federal agents were demanding that I suppress medical findings that could save lives. After the agents left my office, I sat alone for nearly an hour trying to process everything I had learned. David Martinez hadn't just died from a medical anomaly. He had died because he had been unknowingly infected with alien technology that had gradually taken control of his body before ultimately failing and killing him. And according to the federal agents, he was just one of nearly 900 people who had died from the same cause over the past 2 years. I decided to call my mentor, Dr. Robert Chen, who had trained me during my residency at UCSF and had remained a trusted advisor throughout my career. If anyone could help me navigate the ethical and legal complexities of this situation, it would be him. Robert, I said when he answered his phone, I need to discuss a case with you that involves some very unusual circumstances. Can we meet somewhere private this afternoon? We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in Redlands, about 20 minutes from the coroner's office. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing my documentation of David's autopsy, making copies of everything I had found, and trying to decide how much I could tell Dr. Chen without violating the confidentiality that the federal agents had demanded. When I arrived at the coffee shop, I found Dr. Chen already seated in a corner booth, away from other customers. He was a distinguished man in his 70s who had performed thousands of autopsies during his career and had seen every conceivable type of death. If anyone would be able to provide perspective on my situation, it would be him. Sarah, he said as I sat down across from him, you sounded very concerned on the phone. What's going on? I described David's case in general terms, focusing on the medical anomalies I had discovered without mentioning the federal investigation or the national security implications. I wanted Dr. Chen's medical opinion before I revealed the larger context. Dr. Chen listened carefully as I described the crystalline structures, the neural networks, and the electromagnetic properties of David's organs. His expression grew more serious as I provided details about the tissue analysis and the impossible anatomical findings. Sarah, he said when I finished, what you're describing sounds like nothing I've encountered in 50 years of pathology. The integration of foreign structures with human organs while maintaining normal function is theoretically impossible, based on our current understanding of human biology. That's what I thought too, I replied. But I have tissue samples, photographs, and documentation that confirm everything I've told you. The question is, what do I do with this information? Dr. Chen was quiet for several minutes, stirring his coffee and staring out the window at the traffic passing by on Redlands Boulevard. Finally, he looked back at me with an expression I'd never seen before during our 20-year professional relationship. Sarah, he said quietly, I need to tell you something that I've never told anyone before. About 15 years ago, I encountered a case very similar to what you're describing. A young woman found dead with no apparent cause, but with anatomical anomalies that defied medical explanation. My heart rate increased as Dr. Chen continued. I documented everything, just as you did. But before I could complete my investigation, federal agents came to my office and confiscated all of my findings. They told me the case involved national security and that I was not to discuss it with anyone. What did you do? I asked. I complied with their demands, he admitted. I was nearing retirement, and I didn't want to spend my final years fighting the federal government over a single case. But Sarah, I've regretted that decision every day since then. I've wondered how many other people might have died from similar causes while I remained silent. Dr. Chen reached across the table and placed his hand on mine. Sarah, you're facing the same decision I faced 15 years ago. You can cooperate with the authorities and hope they handle this appropriately. Or you can risk your career to ensure that the truth comes out. But you need to understand that if you choose to fight them, they have resources and legal powers that can destroy your professional life. I know, I said. They made that very clear this morning. But Dr. Chen, if there are environmental factors that are exposing people to this technology, and if there are nearly 900 confirmed deaths, how can I remain silent? How can I let more people die to protect a federal investigation that might never reach any conclusions? Dr. Chen nodded slowly. You're right, of course. The medical oath requires us to do no harm and to prioritize patient welfare above all other considerations. But Sarah, you need to be prepared for the consequences of defying federal agencies on national security matters. We spent another hour discussing the ethical, legal, and practical implications of my situation. Dr. Chen shared details about his own encounter with federal agents 15 years earlier, and I began to understand that what I was facing wasn't unprecedented. The government had been suppressing information about these unusual deaths for at least 15 years, possibly longer. When I returned to the coroner's office that afternoon, I found Agent Kim waiting in the parking lot beside a black SUV. He approached me as I got out of my car, and I could see from his expression that he wasn't there for a casual follow-up conversation. Dr. Chen, he said, we've been monitoring your activities today, and we're concerned about your meeting with Dr. Robert Chen. We need to know exactly what you discussed with him. The fact that they had been watching me was both disturbing and informative. It confirmed that they considered me a potential threat to their investigation, and it demonstrated the level of surveillance capabilities they were willing to deploy to maintain control over information. I discussed the medical aspects of David Martinez's case with a colleague, I replied. Dr. Chen is a respected pathologist with 50 years of experience, and I wanted his opinion on the anatomical anomalies I discovered. Agent Kim studied my face for several seconds, apparently trying to determine whether I was telling him the complete truth. Dr. Chen, he said finally, we need your decision about cooperation. Are you willing to transfer your findings to federal custody and maintain confidentiality about this case? I looked at Agent Kim and realized that this was the moment that would define the rest of my career and possibly the rest of my life. I could cooperate with the federal investigation and hope that they would eventually find a way to protect the public from whatever was causing these deaths. Or I could refuse to cooperate and risk everything to ensure that the truth about these deaths became public knowledge. Agent Kim, I said, I need you to answer one question honestly. Are you actively working to identify and neutralize the source of these infections, or are you simply documenting deaths and covering up the evidence? His expression didn't change, but I saw something in his eyes that told me everything I needed to know. The federal task force wasn't trying to solve this problem. They were trying to manage it, to control the flow of information while the deaths continued. I can't give you my findings, I said finally. I won't participate in a cover-up that allows more people to die from something that might be preventable. Agent Kim nodded slowly, as if he had expected my answer. Dr. Chen, he said, you're making a very serious mistake. The resources available to federal agencies to compel cooperation are extensive, and your refusal to cooperate voluntarily will be viewed as obstruction of a national security investigation. I understand the implications, I replied, but I took an oath to do no harm and to prioritize patient welfare above all other considerations. I can't abandon that oath to protect a federal investigation that seems more concerned with secrecy than with saving lives. Agent Kim returned to his SUV and drove away. But I knew this wasn't the end of my interactions with federal agencies. If they were as determined to suppress this information as they appeared to be, they would return with legal compulsion and possibly criminal charges. That evening, I went home to my apartment and spent several hours preparing for what I knew would be the end of my career at the Riverside County Coroner's office. I made additional copies of all my documentation, tissue samples, and photographs from David's autopsy. I prepared detailed summaries of my conversations with the federal agents and my concerns about the scope of this phenomenon. I also drafted a resignation letter that I planned to submit the following morning. I couldn't remain in a position where I might be compelled to suppress medical findings that could save lives, and I couldn't risk having my colleagues become involved in federal investigations because of my refusal to cooperate. But before I submitted my resignation, I wanted to make one final attempt to gather more information about the scope of this problem. If Dr. Harper was correct that there had been 847 similar deaths across 17 states, then there had to be other pathologists, coroners, and medical examiners who had encountered these cases. I spent most of that night researching medical databases, professional forums, and news reports for any mention of unusual autopsy findings or unexplained deaths that matched the characteristics I had observed in David Martinez. What I found was both encouraging and deeply disturbing. There were dozens of references to unusual autopsy findings in young, healthy individuals over the past 2 years. Most of these references were buried in professional journals or medical conference presentations, but they described crystalline structures, neural networks, and electromagnetic anomalies that were remarkably similar to what I had found in David's body. The encouraging aspect was that I wasn't alone. There were other medical professionals who had encountered these cases and had documented their findings, despite apparent pressure to suppress the information. The disturbing aspect was that these cases were occurring much more frequently than the federal agents had indicated, and they were spread across a much wider geographic area. I also found several references to medical examiners and pathologists who had resigned or retired unexpectedly after encountering unusual cases that they weren't allowed to discuss. The pattern suggested that federal agencies had been suppressing information about these deaths for years, and that they were willing to end the careers of medical professionals who refused to cooperate. As dawn approached, I made my final decision about how to handle the David Martinez case and my encounter with federal agents. I would submit my resignation from the coroner's office, but I would also prepare a comprehensive report documenting everything I had discovered and distribute it to medical professionals, journalists, and public safety officials who might be able to take action. I knew this decision would probably end my career in forensic pathology and might expose me to federal prosecution for obstruction of justice or violation of national security laws. But I also knew that I couldn't live with myself if more people died from preventable causes while I remained silent to protect my career. The next morning, I arrived at the coroner's office at 6 a.m. and found Chief Deputy Coroner Rodriguez already in his office, apparently waiting for me. His expression was grim, and I could see that he had already received some kind of communication about my situation with the federal agents. "Dr. Chen," he said as I knocked on his open office door, "please come in and close the door behind you. We need to discuss your future with this office." I sat down across from his desk and placed my resignation letter on the surface between us. "Michael," I said, using his first name for the first time in our professional relationship, "I've prepared my resignation effective immediately. I can't continue working here under circumstances that might compromise my professional integrity or put my colleagues at risk." Rodriguez picked up my resignation letter and read it quickly. "Sarah," he said, "I've received several phone calls about your case yesterday, including one from the FBI and one from someone who claimed to represent the Department of Homeland Security. They've made it very clear that your cooperation in their investigation is not optional. I understand their position," I replied, "but I can't participate in suppressing medical information that might save lives. If federal agencies want to investigate these deaths, they should do it openly and coordinate with the medical community instead of threatening pathologists who try to do their jobs properly." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair and studied me for several moments. "Sarah, you've been one of our best pathologists for 15 years, and I hate to see you leave under these circumstances. But I also understand why you feel you can't stay." The pressure from federal agencies on this case has been unlike anything I've experienced in 25 years with the coroner's office. What kind of pressure? I asked. That was 3 weeks ago. I submitted my resignation that morning and walked out of the Riverside County Coroner's office for the last time. Within 48 hours, federal agents had confiscated my personal copies of David's case files, my computer, and even my personal cell phone. They cited national security provisions that I couldn't legally challenge without risking federal prosecution. But they couldn't confiscate what I had already shared with colleagues across the country, and they couldn't silence the other pathologists who had encountered similar cases. Dr. Morrison from UCLA, Dr. Chen, and at least 12 other medical professionals I contacted have begun documenting these deaths despite federal pressure to remain silent. The truth is, David Martinez wasn't human when he died. Neither were the other 847 people who died from crystalline system failures across 17 states. Something is systematically infiltrating human bodies with technology that we can't understand or replicate, and our own government is more interested in controlling information than protecting citizens. I don't know who's responsible for placing these structures in people's bodies. I don't know how many more people are walking around with artificial organs that could fail at any moment. And I don't know if we'll ever get answers while federal agencies continue to suppress the evidence. What I do know is that the public deserves the truth about what's happening to American citizens, and medical professionals have an obligation to document and share findings that could save lives, regardless of political or national security considerations. I'm now working as a general practitioner in a small town in Oregon, treating routine ailments and trying to live with the knowledge that people are dying from something that might be preventable if the truth were allowed to come out. But I sleep better at night knowing that I didn't sacrifice my professional integrity to protect a government cover-up. If you're watching this video, then at least one person knows the truth about David Martinez and the organ that wasn't human. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to make a difference.